You're listening to the Justice Gap podcast. I'm Callum McRae. The Grenfell Tower fire in summer 2017 was perhaps one of the most devastating events to occur in modern Britain. 72 lives were lost and countless families torn apart by the fire directly. The first stage of the Grenfell inquiry report said that victims paid a, quote, terrible price for a catastrophic failure of industry and government. Beyond the fire itself, Grenfell has caused a miserable ripple effect to those living in buildings that share similar cladding that we now know accelerated the fire on Grenfell. The Times reported that more than 3 million people are now caught up in what's becoming known as the cladding scandal, with some leaseholders receiving remediation bills higher than the initial cost of their flats. William Martin is one of those leaseholders affected. He's a junior doctor and co-founder of the UK Cladding Action Group. He joined me to speak about his situation, the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign, and the government's response. Take me back to you kind of buying this property. What just get us in your head at the time. What's the kind of situation? And it's a big deal, right? Buying this flat.
Ever since an early age, I've always really wanted to own a place. Like, it was kind of something that I just always really wanted to get sorted. And I'd saved and saved and saved, and I really scraped the barrel, and every penny went into the pot to try and build up a reserve of money to put down a deposit. And I found this flat in Sheffield city centre, and I was just like made up. As soon as I walked into it, I was like, this is absolutely what I want. This is great. It's in the city centre. It's really nice inside. And I remember then leaving after having done the first viewing, and I walked straight back to the sales officers, and I was like, yeah, I really want to put down some money on this. This is what I want. I've done my research. I've viewed as many properties as I could possibly do, and everything was great about it. And I was so excited. And I remember the summer of 2015, I was kind of moving up from London and waiting for the keys. And the day that I got the keys, I went round with my mum, and I was just like, yeah, delighted that I'd got this place. And the first year was fantastic, and making it all my own, and it was a big step.
And then, of course, on the morning of June the 14th, 2017, an awful event, the Grenfell Tower fire, changed that dream into a nightmare for you. When did you realise that what you were seeing would play such a dramatic role in your life?
I have to admit, I was watching the events unfold on TV, and I obviously was so shocked and saddened by what I saw, but I didn't really make the connection that what I was witnessing on TV was about to affect my life and so many others so much. And I have to admit as well, even in the week after, when a panel of cladding came off the building and was tested, I still didn't really see the gravity of what was going on. And I think I was in a bit of denial really for the first few months, because I was just like, well, yeah, obviously we're not going to have to pay for that. Like, come on, guys, that's just not going to happen.
Because that would be a logical reaction, I think, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah. And I think it's really important for listeners to realize that this is very different to going outside of your house with a garden and seeing part of the roof has fallen off, because yes, by definition, you would have to fix that roof because you own the soil, you are the freeholder of that property, and you need to remedy your roof. But what it's really important for listeners to understand is that I own a piece of paper that gives me permission to reside in this property for X number of years. I don't own the cladding. I don't own the carpets in the hallway. I don't own the lift shaft. I have to get permission to put my washing out on the balcony. I have to get permission to have a doormat. I'm a leaseholder. And I think that's where the stumbling block has occurred quite often with the general public, not necessarily understanding why it is that we shouldn't have to pay for this.
Before we get into that, William, can you tell me what it is? I know this may be obvious by now, but what's the actual issue with this cladding and the other areas in your building?
So ACM cladding is the same type of cladding as Grenfell, and that's what's on our building. And ACM cladding I'm no expert, but essentially it's a sandwich, and inside the aluminium part of the sandwich is a really, really flammable material, almost like a foam material. It essentially creates a vent where, when it catches on fire, it becomes like a liquid and allows that fire to then spread very rapidly up the side of a building.
And while we're talking about that, obviously this is a large part of this movement and debate is around money, but there's a lasting impact, which is that your flat is flammable, and a lot of these buildings are dangerous to live in. I want to know about that as well, not just the money. What does that have an impact on that kind of feeling that perhaps the building you're living in isn't safe?
Yeah, I mean, so that week after Grenfell, it didn't really sink in, and it didn't really sink in for the first 6 months. And then it was only when I started to really put two and two together, and the Grenfell inquiry started to go on, and the implications of just how dangerous this material was. Because obviously back then, when Grenfell happened, we although we saw the images of it going up the side of the building, we couldn't say for sure that definitely accelerated the fire. But now we can. And I think that was the moment then I started to really feel unsafe in the flat. And when I'd go to sleep at night, you know, besides the finance stuff, you are just thinking, well, right, okay, if a fire were to happen here, how would I get out? Where would I go? What route would I take? And that keeps you awake. And the strain of that is part and parcel of why I ended up saying last year, I actually, for my own mental health and my own sanity, I have to leave this place, which is why I no longer live in the property. And
So you actually felt you couldn't live there anymore?
Yeah, I really did. I think when I drive to Sheffield, it's on the skyline, and I used to come back from the hospital at work as a student, and my heart would actually sink at seeing what used to be my home, because it's not my home. It was just became this place where I was just really miserable, because my life just became consumed by it. And I think that part and parcel of that is as a result of being so active on the campaign. I really did become like, throw every single spare minute of my time into doing cladding. And so my neighbours perhaps were less involved by this, and it consumed them less, but every day became about, which MP am I emailing? Which organisation are we emailing today? What phone call have I got today with someone? And by the end of summer last year, I just knew that I needed to get out of that building.
I mean, I saw on the BBC you talked about your life as kind of being it's all on hold. I mean, what do you mean by that? What was on hold? What did it stop you doing, and how?
So the plan had always been to buy the flat in Sheffield, to live in it, and then sell it at the end of my time at medical school. So life on hold relates to not being able to sell, but life on hold also relates to this feeling of, so even in 2019, I didn't want to sell it there and then, but I had this feeling of being shackled by this building, because if you've got a potential bill of £50,000 hanging over your head, you can't justify going and having a takeout. You can't justify going on any kind of holiday or that new t-shirt that you want, or the nice stuff in the supermarket. Because that's, some people might listen to that and say, well, that's not how I deal with money. But I've always been like that with money, unfortunately. I've always been a bit careful with my money. And when I know I've had that kind of hanging over me, then all of the things that I'd want to be doing in my life were kind of on hold, and including at one point my medical training, because it was kind of like, well, where am I going to go and practice? Because I've got to practice somewhere nearby, because I either stay in the flat and that limits me because I can't move, because I can't sell the flat, or I accept that I have to become this landlord that I didn't want to become of this property, and I need to be relatively close to be able to get back to sort out any problems that may occur. And certainly right now, even though I'm out of the property, my life still does feel like it's on hold, because I can't buy another property. I can't do anything. That's what it feels like to have a life on hold. And there are other people out there that it means different things to. Certainly a lot of people that contact us, one of the main things that they tell us is that, the bill's bad enough, but I want to start a family and I'm in a 1-bedroom flat and I can't start a family in a 1-bedroom flat. And I've been waiting for 4 years to sell this flat or even just to be able to rent it. And I still can't do that. And we've got people who've contacted us and said, I'm in a relationship that has now ended and we are both named on the mortgage and we can't leave each other, but we have now divorced and we are in this house together and we don't know what to do.
There was something the Grenfell inquiry found. They found that there was a quote that said that the residents are in no way to blame, and it's our view that they should bear none of the cost of remediation. Well, in your view, who is to blame, I suppose, and where should the money come from?
So I agree with that. I definitely think that that leaseholders shouldn't have to pay. It's my belief that for years and years, we're not just talking just before Grenfell, we're talking decades of poor building regulation and of lax, turning a blind eye at things that have been built incorrectly. And so I point the finger at the developers, the people who have failed to remediate their buildings, failed to build their buildings correctly in the first place, and failed to address the issues that have then been subsequently identified in the buildings, but are quite happy to go on and continue building all of these big buildings that are popping up in all of these major cities. And I also do hold the government to account as well, because it's the government guidelines that haven't been followed. This isn't one builder who has decided to go against the regulation and built shoddy buildings. This is on a huge scale, huge number of buildings that are affected in every city across the UK. So for my money, whilst I do hold the builders accountable, I do think there has to be some degree of acceptance that this is as a result of poor regulation and poor oversight from the regulators and the government for decades. And that's from all parties. So what I want to see is the developers being truly held to account. Because at the minute, the government have announced a £200 million levy annually for the next 10 years, which would generate £2 billion. And that £2 billion is part and parcel of the £5.1 billion package that has been announced so far. That's really key to make clear, is that the government say that they've announced £5.1 billion worth of funding. They haven't. They've announced £5.1 billion worth of funding minus the £2 billion, which is included in that, which is actually coming from developers. So a lot of people get frustrated and think it's all coming from taxpayer money. It's not, and we have never asked for taxpayer money to fix this problem. But just going back to the developers, £200 million a year does not represent the profit, 20% of the profit of one of the major developers in the UK. It's a drop in the ocean when you look at how much these developers are making. They themselves have come out and said this won't even touch us. This won't harm us in any way, shape or form. So I really look to the government to properly hold the developers to account, because the scale of the problem is estimated at £15 billion at least that's needed. And so the lion's share of the cost still falls on the innocent party. The leaseholder who did not build this building, who paid for all of the surveys to be done when they moved into the property, and yet somehow is faced with this huge bill. I mean, I always say this when I speak to people about this, that when my building was built, I was doing my GCSEs. I sat in an exam hall like I didn't know anything about cladding. I'm not responsible for the materials that were or weren't put on the side of that building. And I certainly shouldn't be held to account for it.
And that must give you a feeling of powerlessness, I suppose. There's something. I mean, it's an observation I made. It's like Grenfell itself, and then the kind of butterfly effects of Grenfell, just really do shine a light on the power balance between these big developers, government, and the people who live in these buildings.
No, that's exactly it. And it's that sense of powerlessness that is amplified by things like the Waking Watch. I came back after a night shift last year to find a letter to tell us, guys, you've got a £7,000 a week waking watch starting. So just to clarify for people what a waking watch is often required in one of these buildings. It's a 24-hour patrol service which allows the building to remain open until the building is remediated. And I came home and found that we were having a £7,000 a week waking watch put in the building because of problems that had been discovered in the building structure. And we had no say. We had no chance as leaseholders to say, oh, well, have you looked at this company? Is this cheaper? Could we do this? No say in the matter. £7,000 slapped on our bills. And we were just like, how do we navigate this? And that amplifies that sense of powerlessness. And as does the insurance, because we don't have any say who insures our building. It's done by our freeholder. And our insurance just skyrocketed by 60%, which actually in comparison to the majority of people is pretty low. But, those are the things that you just feel like, gosh, I don't have any power in this nightmare. I want to get off this train and you don't, of course, really have much communication with the government in terms of where you're at with your application. I know that there's many buildings out there that have applied months and months ago and heard nothing back and are just sitting in limbo land. And what I truly believe, this knee-jerk reaction that has happened and this butterfly effect that has happened since Grenfell, whereby we aren't looking at buildings with a risk-based approach in mind, and instead what we're doing is, gosh, all these buildings just need remediating. Oh, I don't care if this balcony is actually 10 meters away from another balcony and couldn't actually spread a fire to it, but we need to remediate it. We need to remediate this, and this. And there's a lot of people out there that will benefit from that. The cladding industry is booming because they're in demand. Management companies take a cut from the management of this work as well. And so it's the leaseholders at the bottom of the pile that seem to get shafted and dealt the bad card every time.
Let's come on to the campaign, I suppose, then. So how was that set up, the UK Cladding Action Group?
So I thought, I can't be the only one in this situation. This is a nightmare. And I Googled and I found this image of this woman called Ritu on the head of this local newspaper. And I was like, I need to speak to that woman. She then put me in touch with another person down south who also was equally as angry. And then the three of us just had a meeting. It was really short. And we said, we need to unite all of the leaseholders that are affected by this problem in some way, shape or form. And then we just picked a name really quickly and we set up an email, and then The Guardian very kindly launched us. And then we just had this barrage of emails from people being like, I'm in this situation too, and I'm in this situation, and I can't do anything about this, and I can't move. And then 3 years on, we just have got this huge network of people and a large number of buildings that we're in contact with across the whole of the UK. And we've now got to a point where the campaign regularly attends large meetings with, the insurers, with Robert Jenrick, with Lord Greenhalgh, and with the housing associations and all of those, and are a key part in the campaign, because we firmly believe that the people who are at the centre of this problem should have a voice, and that's the leaseholders.
And now I'm sure partly as a result of that campaigning, we've seen the government introduce the Building Safety Bill. Can you give me a bit of a background to that bill and whether just your reaction to it, whether you're encouraged by the moves government are making?
About 6 months ago, we had the Fire Safety Bill, which changed the rules and regulations around external structures in buildings. And we pushed very hard with amendments with Stephen McPartland and Royce and Smith to change the Fire Safety Bill back then to make sure that leaseholders were not charged for historic fire safety defect costs. In the end, we weren't successful, and the promise was that the upcoming Building Safety Bill, which was announced this week, would protect leaseholders and be the most appropriate place to put legislation in place to avoid historic costs being passed on to us. This week, that was announced, and the only protection that I can see that comes from that is that it will become law that building owners have to prove to whoever that they have done their utmost to try and avoid costs being passed on to leaseholders. Now, for me, that it isn't worth the paper it's written on, because that's essentially what they're doing now. The owners are saying, well, look, we've gone after the insurers. We can't do that because it's expired. The developer's no longer here. Oh, we'll write it down on a piece of paper because now it's a legal requirement that you approve it. But sorry, guys, you're going to have to pay. It doesn't really offer us any protection. And it's disappointing that all those MPs said, we'll wait for the building safety bill because the building safety bill is the most appropriate place to protect leaseholders. And evidently it's not. There are other things in the building safety bill, some of which are positive. I do think it's good that a regulator would be in place to protect the building of dangerous buildings in the future. But, we are here now. We are the people living in this situation. And stuff like that is just not really in the spirit of protecting leaseholders. And of course, one of the things that we haven't actually touched on, which is really important, is the loan scheme for buildings under 18 metres, because there's this arbitrary distinction which makes no sense. Buildings over 18 metres get their cladding fixed and paid for. Buildings under 18 metres don't get their cladding fixed and paid for. They have to have a loan scheme that will be £50 a month. But of course, the government has no data on how many buildings under 18 metres are actually affected. So they have no idea how to implement this loan scheme. And what they fail to factor in is the fact that, yes, you can say that £50 a month is affordable. I mean, that's up for debate itself. But if you say that £50 a month is affordable, then you are making an assumption that the leaseholder in the building below 18 metres doesn't face any other fire safety defect remediation costs at the same time, because the £50 a month is just for the removal of the cladding. So if you have a waking watch, you have an insurance increase, and you happen to have a whole range of other things that are not covered by the cladding fund or the cladding loan, you may well be paying £50 a month, but you may also then be expected to pay £4,000 a year on top for all those other problems. And there's no mention of the loan scheme in the building safety bill, which is concerning because leaseholders have been sort of sat waiting for this promise and information about how the loan scheme is going to work. And ultimately, I don't think it is a workable solution, because how do you go back and change people's leases across the country and rewrite them and say that you can take this charge out of their service charges for cladding removal? It's just not a workable solution. And it also fundamentally goes against everything that they've ever said, which is that leaseholders shouldn't have to pay, which is why it really, really frustrates me and all of the other campaigners when Robert Jenrick goes onto TV and says, we're paying for cladding, because you aren't. You're paying for the removal of cladding in buildings above 18 metres. You're not paying for that removal below 18 metres. And even still, sorry to keep going on about the loan scheme, but it's really, really, really problematic, is if you think about a building, particularly in the north of the UK, whereby it's probably only worth, my flat I bought for £130,000, but there are flats in mine that are £80,000. If you're expecting someone to pay £50 a month and the works cost, say, 50 grand, you end up in a situation where you're just in negative equity, given the size of the loan. And this belief that the government keep trotting out and saying that it will restore value to the building by removing the cladding. Well, yes, it will restore value to the building, but not if the building itself and the flat comes with a huge loan that you're going to have to pay. Would you want to buy that? It's ludicrous. And that then touches on that wider impact that the cladding scandal has had on the property market as a whole, because it affects everyone. I meet loads of people who aren't, we've got family friends of ours who aren't affected and who sort of say, I'm not really interested by it. But I say, well, wait till you're in a chain then, where the person lower down the chain is affected by it. It affects everyone. And ultimately what it's going to lead to, if the problem isn't addressed, is these cities that are just full of these buildings which cannot be sold.
You've been listening to the Justice Gap podcast. This episode was produced by me, Callum McRae, and the music was created by Oscar Ralph.